All right, welcome to the Church Dropout podcast. My name is Alan. I'm the host, and today I am riding solo. Church Dropout is a podcast. We talk about issues, topics, and teachings related to faith, life, and culture in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but always insightful. If you have not already, please like, rate, and subscribe to the channel. We appreciate your listenership. I want to talk a little bit about something that I did touch on before, but maybe from a little bit of a different angle. We did a video on Tye Tribit. He said some words on the Breakfast Club about the church, and he basically said the system of the church is whack. The system of the church is whack. Christians were upset about that, and a lot of people took exception to Tye Tribit's words. One of the things that is continuing to be pushed is this idea that Tye Tribit used the wrong platform to have that conversation, that conversation should have been had in-house. That's an in-house conversation. Sort of like when I was younger, if I went to spend the night at somebody else's house, my parents would be like, listen, don't tell family business over there. You keep family business in the home. They don't know us like that. And so, you don't go out to someone's house and you don't tell the business. And so Tye Tribit kind of broke this this rule, this family rule of we don't talk about the church in public. If we have a conversation about the church, we should have that in-house. And the problem with that, or let me say this, if that is correct, okay, let's just assume that that is correct. Then where do we have that conversation? If we can't have it there and we need to have an in-house conversation, where does that conversation need to happen? And the reason why I'm saying that is because I feel like there's a lot of people, including myself, who have tried to have that conversation in the spaces that we're supposed to be able to have that conversation, and it has not been met well when it comes to individuals in the local church community. If you've worked for a church, or if you worked within a church, or you've been connected with a church, and I'm pretty sure some of you have experienced, some of you have shared your experiences, that when you have a conversation that's critiquing the community, it's not met with open arms. It's not received with open arms. And I'm not talking about when a person who has a combative spirit goes up and wants to talk about what's happening within the church. I'm talking about someone who has loved the church, to some degree dedicated their life to the church in service, who cares about that community, who's involved with that community. If there's any critique about the system of church, even by them, you can get labeled a certain way. You get labeled as a difficult person, or you get labeled as a person who exudes criticism, and you get ostracized in a lot of fellowships. Now, I'm saying that this is everywhere, but I'm saying a lot of people try to have these conversations in-house, and it's met with rejection. So my question is, when and where can we have these conversations? Like, when and where are these conversations okay to have? Now, let me say this. Some would say that this conversation is being had, right? When we look at the blogs and we look at content online concerning the epidemic, I guess, of people walking away from the church, as it's been well documented by, all kinds of, outlets, Barna, that the church is in a decline. There seems to be some discussion that's around why people are walking away from the church. And there is some discussion. My problem is that it's not being discussed from the perspective that I hold to. It's being talked about from a totally different perspective. It's just all being lumped into one. So the perspective that mainstream Christianity talks about this issue is from the perspective of people are walking away from church. One, it's possibly because of the great apostasy, right? The scripture talks about people falling away from their faith. I believe that. I think that that's true. I think that is going to happen, and it may be happening now. But it's also spoken of from the perspective of these individuals just don't like authority, or these individuals want to sin. These individuals hate God or hate the church, or they're walking away from Jesus. And that characterization is just not true. There are people out there like myself who love the church, right? We believe what the scripture says about the church, yet we still find issue and take issue with how the church is structured and being ran in today's culture, mainly because it's hindering people from experiencing Christ. That's not everybody, but that's some of us. And so the conversation that's being had from a popular perspective is not this conversation. This conversation is from people who love Jesus and want to see the church represent what it's supposed to represent. That is, be the salt and the light in the world, be the ambassadors and the representative of Christ as we go into the world and make disciples of all people. And that conversation is not being had. I've read countless articles, and we'll continue to talk about those articles. I've read countless articles just really honestly missing the boat on this idea that there are people who love God and love Jesus, but are leaving the church in search of him. And those issues sprout from how we do church today. And the last thing I want to say is this, and I've said this before, but I want to reiterate it. One of the issues that people are having as to why, one of the issues that people are having in this, and I think is feeding into this idea of misunderstanding Tye Tribit's words and why people are having a hard time connecting, is because, and again, this is why I didn't have an issue with what Tye Tribit said, is because we need to make a distinction between what the church is and what the church does. And I think this is part of the problem. And when Tye Tribit said the system of the church is whack, we're so used to identifying the church by what it does versus what the church is. The church cannot be whack because the church is the bride of Christ. The church is the people of God that God has called out of the world into himself. The church is not a building. The church can gather together in a building, but that is not church. We don't go to church. We are the church. And it's that distinction that people are getting lost in today. And this is the distinction that many people feel is hindering the church from being what it's supposed to be in the world, and why there's such an emphasis on how we do church versus what we are as the church, and then expressing our faith outside of that. And so I think this is part of the problem, right? Is that, the church is not willing to have this conversation. And I think they're misunderstanding a whole community of people who love God, love Jesus, and want to see the church represent what it's supposed to represent. But the last thing I'll say is, in my closing, is why is this such a difficult conversation? Like, why doesn't the church want to have this conversation? Why don't people in the church, when this is brought up by congregants or members of that community, why are they met with resistance? And again, this is a part of the problem with the American church today. There is the gathering church, but then there's also the system of church. And the system of church really is an industry in and of itself. Whether we want to realize that or not, it's an industry. And people use it as an industry. I mean, we see it right now as we get into the political season. They are trying to ramp up evangelicals for the vote. So they're speaking to the industry of church, or speaking to the institution of church about some of the things that would get us excited about specific candidates. But when you think about church as an institution or organization, yes, it is definitely something that is, if I can be honest, I think that it's something that's supporting the structure of this idea that we have as the American church in the culture today. So, it's a business, and it's just the reality, right? It's a business, and the structure supports the business, right? I mean, think about how many books we sell. Think about, 20 years ago, seminaries and Bible colleges, they had 1 or 2 degrees. Right now, you look at the seminaries and Bible colleges, and they have 40 or 50 degrees, and they're there, and they're being supported by the local church. Meaning, like, there was no degree to be a youth pastor. That didn't exist, right? You go, you get a biblical studies degree, and then you go teach youth. But now you can go to school to be a youth pastor and a young adult pastor and a pastor of all kinds of stuff that's not in the Bible, right? And that in order for that to work in a university, the system of the church needs to mirror that. So why would we do away with the system of church and strip it down when this system is supporting so many other facets of the church culture altogether. And so it's really intertwined. And again, this is the concern, right? Is that the church is not functioning like an organization. The church is not functioning like an organism. It's functioning as an organization. It's functioning systematically instead of spiritually. And this is what people like myself are trying to call the church back to. The church has a big job to do. It is the power of God in terms of how he's using. It's the means by which God is using to bring about goodness in the world, right? We carry the gospel into the world, and we can't do that if we're not focused on the right things. And we definitely can't do that if our identity is lost. And so if we need to have that conversation, if the Breakfast Club is not the place to have that conversation, then we need to have that conversation in the church. But the problem is that conversation is not usually welcome in the church. And that's usually because any tearing down of the system of church is also tearing down what's supporting the people who are within the church. And that's what people are concerned with. And so, I don't know. These are just some thoughts that I had. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below, and I'll try to interact with those. But that's it. That's all I have. Thank you so much for tuning into the Church Dropout. Like I said before, like, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast at. I'd appreciate it. Until the next time, we out. God bless.